It was a crisp autumn evening in the quiet town of Willow Creek. The kind of evening where the sky blazed orange and red before surrendering to the quiet gray of dusk. 12-year-old Tommy Pearson stood on the back porch of his family's house, staring out at the old oak tree in their backyard. Its gnarled branches loomed like skeletal arms, clutching at the sky. This wasn't any ordinary tree. It was the tree that housed the Pearson family's cherished treehouse, a two-story wooden structure built by Tommy's late grandfather. The treehouse had been Tommy's sanctuary for as long as he could remember. But recently, something about it had changed. It felt off. Tommy's parents dismissed his fears as overactive imagination, but he knew what he had heard. Whispers. Low, guttural voices that seemed to echo from the treehouse at night. It started a week earlier, on a windy night. Tommy had snuck out with a flashlight to grab his favorite comic book he'd left behind in the treehouse. The wind howled through the oak's branches, making them groan and creak. He climbed the rickety wooden ladder, his heart pounding harder with each step. When he reached the top, the air inside the treehouse felt colder than outside, almost unnaturally so. As Tommy flicked on his flashlight, its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar space. There was his beanbag chair, his stash of comics, and the little chalkboard he and his friends used to draw silly monsters. But then he saw it, something that didn't belong. A handprint. It was smeared on the inside wall, made of some dark, sticky substance. Tommy's breath hitched as he ran a finger across it. The substance was still wet. That's when he heard it, the whisper. "Tommy." The voice was raspy and faint, but it was there, coming from somewhere deep within the treehouse. His flashlight flickered. Panic surged through him, and he scrambled down the ladder, nearly slipping in his haste. He didn't stop running until he was safe inside the house, locking the door behind him. The next day, Tommy confided in his older sister, Emma. At 16, Emma was the rational one, the skeptic who always looked for logical explanations. But when Tommy told her about the whisper and the handprint, her confident demeanor faltered. "Grandpa used to say this tree was special," Emma said, her voice quieter than usual. "He told me it was one of the oldest trees in the county. Said it had seen things, bad things. But that was just his way of telling ghost stories." "Do you think it's haunted?" Tommy asked, wide-eyed. Emma shook her head. "There's no such thing as ghosts, Tommy. It's probably just your imagination. Or maybe a prank." But Tommy wasn't convinced, and deep down, neither was Emma. Determined to prove his bravery, Tommy decided to face the treehouse again. This time, Emma came with him, carrying their dad's old baseball bat for protection. As they approached the treehouse, the night seemed unnaturally still. No wind, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. They climbed the ladder together, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. But then Emma noticed something strange. The chalkboard, which had been blank earlier, now had writing on it. The words were jagged and uneven, as though scrawled by an unsteady hand. "Leave now." Emma's grip on the bat tightened. "Okay, this is officially creepy." Tommy pointed at the floor. "What's that?" In the center of the treehouse was a small pile of objects, bones, feathers, and what looked like old coins. They were arranged in a circular pattern, almost ritualistic. "Who would do this?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Before Tommy could answer, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was loud and clear, as if the speaker were standing right behind them. "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight beams wavered as both kids spun around. There was no one there. But the whisper continued, now overlapping with other voices, all speaking in a chilling, incoherent symphony. The temperature in the treehouse plummeted, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. Emma grabbed Tommy's hand. "We're leaving. Now." As they scrambled down the ladder, something moved in the shadows above them. A dark figure, barely more than a silhouette, leaned out of the treehouse's window, watching them. The next day, Emma did some digging at the local library while Tommy stayed home, too scared to return to the treehouse. What she found sent shivers down her spine. Decades ago, before the Pearson family owned the property, the land had belonged to a reclusive man named Victor Crowley. According to old newspaper clippings, Victor had been accused of several gruesome murders. He lured his victims into the woods, and though their bodies were never found, locals believed he buried them near the oak tree. After Victor's disappearance, strange sightings were reported near the tree, shadowy figures, eerie whispers, and objects moving on their own. Emma showed the articles to Tommy that evening. I think whatever's in the treehouse is connected to Victor Crowley." Tommy's face paled. "You mean he's still here? Like his ghost?" "Maybe," Emma admitted. "Or maybe it's something worse." That night, the siblings decided they couldn't ignore the treehouse any longer. Armed with flashlights, salt, something Emma had read about in a book on spirits, and their dad's bat, they ventured into the backyard one last time. As they climbed the ladder, the air grew colder with each step. Inside the treehouse, the whispers were louder than ever, swirling around them like a storm. The chalkboard now read, "Leave or die." Emma spread a line of salt across the doorway, her hands shaking. "This is supposed to keep spirits out," she said. But as soon as she spoke, the salt line blew away as if by an invisible wind. The whispers grew into screams, and the dark figure from before emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid but twisted, its face a grotesque mask of decay. "You shouldn't have come back," it snarled, its voice a guttural growl. Emma swung the bat, but it passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. Tommy grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the entity. To their surprise, it recoiled, hissing in pain. "It doesn't like the light," Tommy shouted. The siblings quickly turned on both flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness. The figure writhed and shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. As it retreated, the whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. When the figure finally vanished, the temperature in the treehouse returned to normal. The siblings stared at each other, breathing heavily. "Do you think it's gone?" Tommy asked. Emma nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. "I think so. For now." The Pearsons never used the treehouse again. A week later, their dad had the entire structure dismantled, much to Tommy and Emma's relief. But even without the treehouse, the old oak tree remained, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like a warning. And sometimes, on quiet autumn nights, Tommy swore he could still hear the whispers. In the sleepy town of Pine Hollow, the Morris family had recently moved into an old colonial house at the edge of the woods. The backyard was vast, a sprawling field of golden grass leading to an ancient tree that stood like a sentinel. Perched in its arms was a weathered treehouse, one that had been there for decades, judging by its moss-covered wood and rusty nails. The treehouse instantly caught the attention of the youngest Morris sibling, 11-year-old Ellie. "It's perfect," she had exclaimed, tugging on her older brother Sam's sleeve. At 15, Sam was less enthusiastic but agreed to help clean it up. Their father smiled as he watched them from the porch. "It'll be good for you kids. A little adventure." But that adventure would become something far darker. The first time Ellie climbed into the treehouse, she felt a strange chill. It wasn't the weather, this chill seeped into her bones, making her shiver despite the sunny day. The interior was cramped but cozy, with old planks and forgotten trinkets left by previous owners. She found a rusty toy car, a faded photograph of two children standing under the tree, and a notebook with pages torn out. "Someone must have had a lot of fun here," Ellie said, running her fingers over the carvings on the walls, names, dates, and what looked like little stick figure drawings. But Sam noticed something strange. "Why does it feel like someone's been here recently?" he muttered, pointing at the dust-free floorboards and the faint smell of smoke, like an extinguished candle. "Maybe it's animals," Ellie said, brushing it off. But the siblings didn't know this treehouse held memories that refused to be forgotten. That night, Ellie woke up to the sound of creaking wood. She thought it was the wind at first, but the sound was rhythmic, like footsteps moving up and down the treehouse ladder. She peeked out her bedroom window, which faced the backyard. The treehouse stood still, bathed in moonlight, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching her. The next morning, Ellie told Sam about the noises. "I think someone's sneaking into the treehouse at night." Sam shrugged. "Probably just raccoons." But Ellie wasn't convinced. She decided to investigate that evening. Armed with a flashlight and her dog, Max, she ventured out just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The treehouse loomed above her, its shadow stretching across the yard. Max whimpered as they approached, his tail tucked between his legs. "What's wrong, boy?" Ellie whispered, but the dog wouldn't budge. He barked once, a sharp, fearful sound, then bolted back to the house. Ellie hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She climbed the ladder slowly, the wood creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the top, the air inside the treehouse felt heavy, almost suffocating. She swept the flashlight across the walls, and froze. The carvings were different. The stick figures she'd seen earlier had changed. Now, they were sprawled across the walls in chaotic clusters, their arms raised as if reaching for something. And in the center of the wall was a new carving, a single eye, staring back at her. Ellie scrambled down the ladder, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Sam!" she shouted as she ran back into the house. Her brother looked up from his video game, annoyed. "What now?" "The carvings, they're moving," Ellie stammered, trying to catch her breath. Sam rolled his eyes. "You're just freaking yourself out. It's an old treehouse. Stuff like that doesn't happen." But Ellie was insistent. She begged Sam to come with her, and eventually, he relented. "Fine. But if this is another one of your ghost stories, I'm not buying it." When they returned to the treehouse, Sam noticed it immediately. The air felt colder, heavier, like walking into a freezer. He climbed up first, flashlight in hand, with Ellie close behind. "See?" she whispered, pointing at the walls. Sam's jaw tightened. The carvings were everywhere now, dozens of stick figures packed into every inch of space. And in the center, the eye seemed larger, its lines etched deeper into the wood. It almost looked alive. "Okay," Sam said, his voice shaky. "This is weird." Suddenly, the treehouse shook, as if someone had grabbed the trunk of the tree and was shaking it violently. The flashlight flickered, and the siblings heard a sound that made their blood run cold, a low, guttural laugh that echoed from the walls. "Run!" Sam shouted. They scrambled down the ladder and sprinted back to the house, slamming the door behind them. Their parents dismissed their story as a prank, but the fear in their eyes told a different story. The next day, Sam and Ellie decided to dig deeper. They visited the local library, poring over old records and newspaper clippings. What they discovered was chilling. The treehouse had been built by a man named Richard Graves in the 1950s for his two children, Henry and Abigail. But tragedy struck when the children went missing one summer. Their bodies were never found, and Richard was suspected of foul play. Witnesses claimed to have seen him sitting in the treehouse at night, talking to someone who wasn't there. Weeks later, Richard was found dead in the treehouse, hanging from the rafters. Locals began to avoid the property, claiming it was cursed. Over the years, the house changed hands multiple times, but strange occurrences always seemed to follow. That night, Ellie and Sam made a pact. They needed to confront whatever was in the treehouse once and for all. Armed with flashlights, salt, and an old Bible they found in the attic, they crept into the backyard. The treehouse loomed above them, dark and foreboding. As they climbed the ladder, the wind picked up, howling through the branches. The air felt electric, charged with an unseen energy. Inside, the walls seemed alive. The carvings shifted and writhed, the stick figures twisting into grotesque shapes. The eye in the center glowed faintly, its gaze following their every move. Ellie opened the Bible, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" she whispered. Sam sprinkled a circle of salt around them. "We make it leave." As Ellie began to read a prayer aloud, the treehouse erupted with noise, screams, laughter, and whispers all at once. The walls shook, and the eye began to bleed, dark rivulets streaming down the wood. "Keep going," Sam shouted. The temperature dropped further, their breath visible in the freezing air. The figures on the walls lunged toward them, but the salt line held them back. Ellie's voice grew louder, steadier, as she read the final lines of the prayer. With a deafening roar, the treehouse exploded in light. The carvings vanished, the walls stilled, and the oppressive presence lifted. The next morning, their father found them asleep in the backyard, curled up under a blanket. The treehouse was gone, reduced to splinters scattered across the ground. Sam and Ellie never spoke of that night again, but they both knew the truth. The treehouse wasn't just a place, it was a prison for something dark, something ancient. And though it was gone, they couldn't shake the feeling that the eye was still watching them, waiting for another chance to return. The town of Ashwood was quiet, tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests that stretched for miles. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long, except for the ones buried deep in the woods. At the heart of these woods stood the Ashwood Treehouse, perched high in the branches of an ancient elm. For decades, it was a place of wonder for the local children. But over time, whispers of strange occurrences turned it into a place of fear. Some claimed they heard voices calling to them from the treehouse at night. Others said that anyone who spent the night there came back different. 16-year-old Ryan and his best friend, Jake, had heard the stories all their lives. But they didn't believe in ghosts or curses. So when a group of their friends dared them to spend the night in the Ashwood Treehouse, they didn't hesitate. "It's just an old treehouse," Jake scoffed as they hiked through the woods at sunset. "Probably a bunch of creaky boards and spiders." Ryan wasn't so sure. Something about the treehouse gave him an uneasy feeling. Maybe it was the way the elm's twisted branches seemed to reach out like claws, or the way the air grew colder the closer they got. When they reached it, the treehouse looked worse than Ryan expected. The wood was dark and rotting, the ladder missing several rungs. The windows were covered in grime, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to one side. "Doesn't look too inviting, does it?" Ryan muttered. Jake grinned. "What, you scared? Come on, man. It's just wood and nails." With that, Jake climbed the ladder, ignoring the groaning protest of the wood. Ryan followed, his heart pounding harder with each step. The inside of the treehouse was cramped and smelled of mildew. Faded drawings covered the walls, childish scribbles of stick figures and animals. But as Ryan's flashlight scanned the room, he noticed something odd. One of the drawings showed a stick figure inside the treehouse, surrounded by others standing outside. The stick figure inside had large, hollow eyes, drawn in thick, jagged strokes. Below it were the words, "Don't let IT in." "Creepy," Jake said, pointing at the drawing. "Probably some kid trying to scare people." Ryan nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that the drawing was more of a warning than a prank. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, they unrolled their sleeping bags and tried to settle in for the night. The night was unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Ryan lay awake, staring at the treehouse ceiling, while Jake snored softly beside him. Then he heard it, a faint knock, like something tapping on the treehouse wall. At first, he thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind. But there was no wind, and the knocks were too deliberate, too rhythmic. Knock. 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 "Jake," Ryan whispered, shaking his friend awake. "Did you hear that?" Jake groaned, sitting up. "Hear what?" The knocking stopped. Ryan stared at the wall, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "It was probably just an animal," Jake said, lying back down. "Go to sleep, man." But Ryan couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the wood sent his heart racing. And then, just as he began to drift off, he heard it again, this time louder. Knock. 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 Okay, what the hell was that? Jake sat up, his face pale. Before Ryan could answer, a low whisper echoed through the treehouse. It was faint, almost inaudible, but the words were unmistakable. "Let me in." The flashlight beams darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. Just the two of them in the cold, suffocating air. "Let's get out of here," Ryan said, his voice shaking. Jake nodded, and they scrambled for the ladder. But as they reached the edge of the treehouse, the ladder was gone. "What the?" Jake leaned out, shining his flashlight down. The ladder, which had been old but sturdy when they climbed up, now lay splintered on the ground below. "We're stuck," Ryan whispered, panic rising in his chest. The whispers grew louder, circling around them like a cold wind. "Let me in. Let me in." Ryan backed into a corner, his flashlight shaking. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifted across the wall. It didn't belong to either of them. "Jake. It's here," Ryan whispered. The shadow stretched, twisting and writhing until it formed a figure, tall, with long, spindly limbs and hollow eyes that glowed faintly. It stepped out from the wall, its movements jerky, unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice a chilling mix of anger and sorrow. Jake swung his flashlight toward the figure, but the light passed through it, as if it were made of smoke. The entity reached out, its bony fingers inches from Ryan's face. "Don't touch me!" Ryan screamed, throwing his flashlight at it. The light exploded in a burst of sparks, and the entity recoiled, hissing. "Light!" Jake shouted. "It doesn't like light." Ryan fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight app. The beam was weak but enough to make the entity retreat, its form flickering like a dying flame. The boys shone their flashlights in every direction, forcing the entity to retreat into the shadows. But they knew it wouldn't stay away for long. "We have to jump," Ryan said, looking at the ground below. "Are you crazy? That's a 20-foot drop," Jake argued. "We don't have a choice," Ryan shouted as the whispers began to grow louder again. "It's coming back." Without waiting, Ryan climbed onto the edge of the treehouse and leapt. He landed hard, pain shooting up his leg, but he was alive. Jake followed moments later, crashing into the dirt beside him. The boys didn't look back as they ran through the woods, branches whipping at their faces. The whispers followed them, growing fainter with each step until, finally, they reached the edge of the forest. Ryan and Jake never spoke about what happened in the treehouse, not to their friends, not to their families. The treehouse remained standing, but neither of them dared go near it again. Years later, Ryan heard that the elm tree had been struck by lightning during a storm, reducing the treehouse to ashes. But even then, locals swore they could still hear whispers coming from the woods at night, calling for anyone brave, or foolish,